would you wipe out your family to be with me?
The just-released video shows 30-year-old Nichol Kessinger being interrogated.
Did you ever say anything to him about, like...
Never.
Anything about his kids being a problem? Anything about his wife being a problem?
Never. This shocked me just as much as I think it shocked the rest of the world.
She breaks down, sobbing over the gruesome fate of the children, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste.
He's so disgusting. I'm so ashamed of him.
Why? How? I don't even understand how you could, like, bring yourself to do that to somebody who's, like, that big.
Was Nichol Kessinger simply the affair partner of a murderer? Or does the evidence suggest something more? Stay with me, because by the time we reach the end of this, you will understand why researchers and analysts who have spent years inside the discovery record say this case is not closed. Not by a long way. If this is the kind of deep, evidence-based analysis you want more of, you are in the right place. This is True Crime Drill. Hit that subscribe button now, because what we cover here goes beyond the headlines. And if this video brings you something you have never heard before, click like. It tells us this work matters. Before we go any further, the ground rules matter. Nichol Kessinger was never charged with any crime. She was never arrested. She cooperated with law enforcement, sat for multiple recorded interview sessions, and in the official case record, she is classified as a witness, a woman who dated a married man, who turned out to be a murderer. That is the official position. The official position has always had problems, and in 2026, those problems have names, timestamps, and GPS coordinates. Let us start, not with what anyone suspects, but with what the verified evidence actually shows. In the months leading up to August 13th, 2018, Nichol Kessinger drove the same route to her job at Anadarko Petroleum every single day. Investigators subpoenaed months of her phone records, and the pattern of cell tower pings mapped her daily commute with total consistency. The same roads, the same towers, morning after morning, a completely predictable, completely documented routine. Until August 13th. At 6:16 in the morning on the day of the murders, Nichol Kessinger's phone pinged a cell tower it had never once pinged in all those months of prior records. That tower placed her phone in the proximity of one specific address, the Watts family home at 2825 Saratoga Trail. The same address she had searched on Google less than 36 hours earlier. 6:16 in the morning is not a random timestamp. Context is everything here. Chris Watts had left his driveway at approximately 5:45 that morning. His daughters were alive in the back seat of his work truck. He was headed toward the Survey 319 oil well site, roughly 62 miles away. By 6:16, Chris was already on the highway, approximately 30 minutes from the job site. At that exact moment, Nichol Kessinger's phone was in the proximity of the family home he had just left, and she was placing a call, not to Chris, to a man named Jim. Jim is not a peripheral figure in this case. During later interviews, investigators established that Chris Watts personally knew Jim. Photographs exist of Chris, Nichol, and Jim together at the Colorado sand dunes. He was embedded in their shared social world. And on the morning of August 13th, 2018, at 6:16 in the morning, near the address she had just searched online, Nichol Kessinger called him. Days later, when investigators asked Nichol whether Jim could serve as her alibi witness, whether he could confirm where she was that morning, this is what she said. She told them he could confirm her whereabouts. She said he could say yes. He was there, done, totally. And then she said she did not really want to involve him because it would not be fair to him. She was being asked to produce the one person who could place her somewhere other than the Watts family home on the morning her lover murdered his family, and she declined because it would not be fair to him. That question has never been answered. To understand why that phone ping carries the weight it does, you have to walk through the morning of August 13th with the precision the evidence deserves. This is not a story of one coincidence. This is a story of multiple data points, each individually strange, each individually explainable in isolation, that stop being individually explainable the moment you lay them end to end in the exact sequence they occurred. At 5:18 in the morning, surveillance footage from the Watts neighborhood captured the lights of Chris's work truck turning on. A figure moves toward the vehicle. At 5:45, Chris Watts drives away from Saratoga Trail. One detail stood out to law enforcement immediately. That morning, Chris had parked his truck directly in front of the garage. His neighbor Nate, who lived directly across the street, confirmed to investigators that in all the years he had known Chris, he had never once seen him park that way before. The positioning was not accidental. It blocked the view from the street of everything Chris was doing at the back of that truck during those 18 minutes before he drove away. At 6:16, as already established, Nichol Kessinger's phone pings near the Watts home. She calls Jim. At 6:30, Chris is on the highway. He contacts co-worker Cody Roberts 3 separate times before Roberts finally picks up. Roberts tells Chris he just fueled up in Kersey, approximately 30 minutes from Survey 319. Chris knows that if Cody drives directly to the site, he could arrive at the wrong moment, so he sends a preemptive lie. A text message stating he is already at Survey 319, then a follow-up asking where Cody is heading first thing that morning. When Roberts mentions that another co-worker, Chad McNeil, might also be heading to the site, Chris tries calling McNeil. No answer. At 6:41 in the morning, he texts McNeil asking whether he is headed to Survey 319, reiterating that he is already there. McNeil replies that he is not heading there immediately. Chris sends a thumbs-up emoji. While his daughters were in the back of that truck, he sent a thumbs-up emoji. At 6:52, Chris Watts arrives at Survey 319. What happens in the next 30 to 60 minutes is covered by his guilty plea and the court record. This narration will not elaborate beyond what the court established. At 7:40, standing at that oil field, Chris Watts sends a text to Shanann's phone. The words he typed were, "If you take the kids somewhere, please let me know where they are at." He sent those words while standing feet from where they were. At 8:25, Chris stages a call to Shanann's phone. 1 minute later, he searches Google for Primrose School at Vista Ridge, the academy where Bella and Celeste were supposed to begin their first day. He calls the school and informs staff that the girls will not be attending. He hangs up before they can respond. At 10:10, Chris opens Google and searches for the lyrics to a Metallica song called Battery. The Discovery records confirmed that Chris had shared those exact lyrics with Nico Kessinger during their affair. She had replied asking what the song meant to him. She knew that song. She had that conversation with him. And hours after the murders, he searched for those same lyrics again. At 10:28, Shanann's mother Sandra texts Chris asking if Shanann is okay. At 10:30, they speak by phone. Chris manufactures his first cover story. Shanann went to a friend's house. She is in one of her moods. There was a small disagreement. At 10:33, immediately after hanging up with the mother of the woman he has just murdered, Chris Watts opens Google and searches for hotels in Aspen, Colorado. 9 minutes later, at 10:42, he calls the Westin Snowmass Resort. Pause on that sequence for a moment, because this is one of the most revealing timelines in the entire case, and it has never been adequately explained. At 10:30, a man is on the phone with his mother-in-law, telling her his wife probably just needed some space. At 10:33, that same man is searching for mountain resort hotels. At 10:42, he is calling a ski resort in Colorado. What does a man who genuinely does not know where his wife and daughters are do in those 9 minutes? What does a man who has just reassured his mother-in-law that everything will probably be fine do immediately after hanging up? He does not search for resort hotels. He does not call the Westin Snowmass. Not unless he is not looking for his family. Not unless he already knows exactly where they are and is thinking about where he is going next. That hotel search 9 minutes after hanging up with Sandra Ruchek is one of the most illuminating timestamps in the entire discovery record, and it connects directly to something Chris Watts later told his prison cellmate. In June 2026, Dylan Tooman, a former cellmate of Chris Watts at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, released a book series based on their conversations during the time they shared a cell. Before evaluating what Tooman reported, intellectual honesty requires being transparent about how this source should be treated. Tooman's accounts originate from Chris Watts's own words. Chris Watts is not a reliable narrator of his own history. He is a man who, in verified prison letters reported by multiple outlets, compared his life sentence to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. He is a man who has consistently distributed blame to the women around him, while framing himself as someone who was led astray rather than someone who chose. Nothing Chris Watts says is accepted here at face value. The only meaningful question when evaluating Tooman's book is this: does what he reports align with evidence that already existed independently before his book was published? On several specific points, the answer is yes. Tooman writes that on the morning of August 13th, Chris met with Nichol before heading to the oil site, that she was calm, that she told him to go to work as normal, that they discussed how to make the family's disappearance appear as though they had simply gone missing. And when Tooman asked Chris directly whether Nichol helped with what happened to his daughters, Chris reportedly answered yes. That account cannot be independently confirmed. But here is what matters. Every piece of documented evidence that makes Tooman's claims worth examining was already sitting in the public record before his book existed. The phone ping near the Watts home at 6:16. The prior Google search of the home address. The Aspen Hotel calls made hours after the murders. The 156 minutes of calls Nichol could not coherently account for. The deleted phone. The call placed seconds after a police interview began. None of those facts came from Dylan Tooman. They were in the discovery record. They were established by the original investigation. Tooman's claims do not create the pattern of suspicion. They arrive on top of a pattern that was already fully documented. If that account carries even partial truth, then the Aspen Hotel search takes on a different meaning entirely. It becomes not the behavior of a panicking man improvising in real time, but the behavior of a man who believed his future had already been arranged. A man who thought someone else was managing the remaining details. A man who was already planning the first chapter of a new life. That is a fundamentally different kind of crime. In the days after August 13th, Nichol Kessinger sat with investigators for multiple recorded interview sessions. Taken without context, those recorded interviews can read as the testimony of a cooperative and confused witness doing her best to help. She appears engaged. She provides detail. She asks questions back. But there is a second way to read those interviews, and it requires placing her phone records on one side and her answers on the other. On the night of August 13th, between 9:48 in the evening and 2:18 in the morning, phone records show Nichol Kessinger and Chris Watts spoke in multiple calls, totaling 2 hours and 36 minutes. 156 minutes of conversation on the night of the murder. When Detective Kobach walked Nichol through those call logs, reading the timestamps and the durations, asking what was discussed during each, here is what she offered. She said she would almost want to come in and drag and drop all of her texts to show where they were going. She offered to return and reorganize her own text messages to fill in the gaps she could not explain verbally. That meeting was scheduled. She never came back. Now hold that against this. In those same interview sessions, Nichol Kessinger provided investigators with detailed, chronologically precise accounts of events from weeks and months earlier in the relationship. Specific dates, specific restaurants, specific conversations she recalled with confidence. Her memory for July was sharp and specific. Her memory for the night of August 13th, the most consequential night in the entire case, was, in her own words, fragmented. Memory does not work that way by accident. What she did say about that night is more revealing than what she claimed she could not remember. When investigators pressed her on why she kept calling through the early hours of August 14th, why she was distressed, why she could not sleep, she said this: all those phone calls at the very end of the night, that was her freaking out. She said if you look at her texts, a lot of it was saying she could not sleep, that she was really scared, asking where his family was, that it was her freaking out, and him calling to assure her, stop on those words, I am really scared. Where is your family? At this point in her official account to investigators, Nichol had told them she assumed Shanann had simply left to stay at a friend's house after an argument. Couples fight. Give her space. She will come back. That was her stated explanation for why she was not alarmed when Chris told her his family was gone. So what was she scared of? If she genuinely believed Shanann had left voluntarily, there was nothing to fear at 2 a.m. There was nothing requiring reassurance. There was no reason to lose sleep. She had absolutely no basis for being scared, unless she already knew or suspected something she had not disclosed to law enforcement. And then there is the moment that may be the single most consequential detail in Nichol Kessinger's entire record in this case. At 1:51 in the morning on August 14th, Nichol called Chris. At 1:58, while they were still on that call, Chris began receiving calls from the Frederick Police Department. They ended their call. Chris phoned Officer Goodman back at 2:05 in the morning. And then, within seconds of that police call beginning, phone records show Nichol Kessinger called Chris's number again. The discovery documents note that Watts and Kessinger were in communication during or immediately around Officer Goodman's call. Whether she could hear the conversation is something the records raise, but do not definitively resolve. What the records do show is the sequence itself. At 1:51, she calls Chris. At 1:58, police begin calling his phone. They end their call. He phones the officer back, and within seconds, she calls again. That is not someone who forgot to hang up. That is not a passive act. You do not call someone back at the exact moment they answer a police call at 2 a.m, unless what that call contains matters to you. Unless the answer matters to you in a way it should not matter to someone with nothing to hide. In her interviews, Nichol's explanation for her behavior that night rested entirely on anxiety. A woman who had developed genuine feelings for Chris and simply could not sleep. Upset, seeking reassurance. But anxious people seeking reassurance from someone they care about do not call back at the precise second a police call connects at 2 a.m. People who need to know what law enforcement is asking do that. People who have a stake in the answer do that. That 2:05 call was the last time Nichol Kessinger and Chris Watts ever spoke. Shortly after, she deleted virtually everything from her phone before surrendering it to investigators. Why does someone with nothing to hide wipe their phone at 2 a.m. after their partner's family has been reported missing? Why does someone who believes Shanann simply stepped out to cool down feel the urgent need to erase their device before handing it to police? Those are not rhetorical questions designed to inflame. They are documented actions requiring documented explanations that have never been provided. This case would have looked entirely different without 3 women who loved Shanann and refused to wait. Nico Atkinson had picked Shanann up from Denver International Airport at 1:48 in the morning on August 13th. She was one of Shanann's closest friends. She knew the marriage was deteriorating. She had been part of the conversations Shanann was having about her growing unease, about Chris's emotional withdrawal, about her certainty that something was wrong. When 9:15 arrived and Shanann missed her prenatal appointment scheduled for genetic and gender testing for her pregnancy with Nico, Nichol did not wait. She drove directly to the doctor's office. Shanann was a no-show. Nichol then drove to 2825 Saratoga Trail. She tried to get inside. Her son looked through the garage window and saw Shanann's car. He saw the children's car seats still inside. Nico Atkinson called the police, while Chris was at a crime scene managing co-workers through text messages and emoji responses. She stood on that driveway and refused to leave until officers arrived. She is the primary reason this case broke in hours rather than days. Cassie, one of Shanann's closest friends, sent Chris a message on the afternoon of August 13th that cut through every manipulation attempt he made. When Chris wrote to her saying he really did not want her to think he was a bad person, Cassie responded with clarity that has never been improved upon. She told him directly. Right now, she did not care about him, did not care about his relationship or what kind of person he was or was not, and she was not trying to be rude when she said that she had one question: where is Shanann? Everything else was noise. And Addie, the moment she got off the phone with Chris that afternoon, sent a single message to the group of friends that stands as one of the most precise, most accurate statements made by anyone in the first hours of this case. She wrote that the police needed to look at Chris's cell phone and his computer. One phone call with him was all she needed. She named the evidence that would prove it. She was right. These women compressed the timeline before anyone could finish erasing what had been done. Their speed, their refusal to accept the cover story, their insistence on the truth, created the conditions under which the evidence was preserved. And that matters directly to the open questions in this case, because if they had waited even a few more hours, more data might have been gone before investigators ever began. After Chris Watts entered his guilty plea in November 2018, Nichol Kessinger gave a single interview to the Denver Post. She described herself as a victim of his manipulation. She said she had been deceived. She changed her name. She left Colorado. She has not spoken publicly since. District Attorney Michael Rourke did not clear her. That distinction is critical and must be stated precisely. Rourke made a legal and evidentiary determination that the evidence as assembled at that specific point in time did not meet the threshold required for prosecution. That is a specific legal calculation made at a specific moment, based on what existed in the file on that day. It is not an acquittal. It is not a declaration of innocence. It is a decision made within the limits of what the evidence could prove at the time charges would have needed to be filed. What Rourke did say publicly was that Nichol Kessinger's information was, in his words, a bombshell that helped them build their case. He described Chris Watts as appearing to have had every intention of starting a brand new life with her. That is not the language of a prosecutor who believed the affair partner was entirely uninvolved. That is the language of a man who understood the full weight of what she knew, and when she knew it. He said the evidence did not support charging her. He did not say she had nothing to do with it. As of 2026, Chris Watts is 40 years old. He has been incarcerated at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, for more than 7 years. He works as a custodian. He attends Bible study. He writes letters, primarily to women. His commissary spending, according to reporting from People magazine citing a prison source, goes primarily towards stamps and paper. In letters written in late 2025 and reported publicly in early 2026, Watts wrote to a pen pal that God had a plan for him, that he wants him in prison, that this is his will, just like it was his will for Jesus to die. He compared his life sentence to the crucifixion. This is the same man who admitted, in verified prison correspondence reported by multiple outlets since 2021, that he had planned these murders over the course of several weeks. The same man who admitted secretly giving Shanann oxycodone in an attempt to end her pregnancy because he believed it would be easier to leave her for Nichol Kessinger if she were not carrying his child. The medical examiner's toxicology report confirmed oxycodone in Shanann's system. The same man who admitted he tried to smother Bella and Celeste in their beds at home that morning before loading them into his truck. They woke up. He still drove them to that oil field. These are not the acts of a man overcome by one catastrophic moment of emotion. These are the acts of a man who made deliberate, calculated decisions across weeks of planning, and who was willing to do whatever was required to reach the outcome he had chosen. Dylan Tooman, who shared a cell with Watts, described the psychological pattern that defined Chris both inside and outside that prison. According to Tooman's account in a 2024 interview with the Daily Mail, Watts will talk to a woman, and she becomes his everything very quickly. He becomes obsessed and will do whatever that person asks of him. The consuming, all-obliterating attachment to a single woman. The pattern that many analysts identified as a driving factor in the events of August 13th continues in that prison cell today. It did not begin with the crime. It did not end with the conviction. It is the architecture of who he is. Dr. Lena Derheli, a licensed psychotherapist who conducted extensive research on the Watts case using the discovery documents, interviews with criminal psychologists, and her own clinical expertise in psychopathology, concluded that Watts exhibits significant narcissistic and psychopathic traits, specifically the covert variety that allows someone to function as a devoted husband and father on the surface, while being capable of calculated, premeditated destruction underneath. The covert nature of those traits, she argues, is precisely why no one around him saw it coming. And here is why that psychological profile matters beyond the portrait of one incarcerated man, because the same architecture of manipulation that Chris Watts deploys in his prison letters is the same architecture he would have used in the weeks before August 13th. The same pattern of creating emotional dependency, the same pattern of making the person in front of him believe they were the center of his universe, the same pattern of making someone feel so uniquely understood, so specifically desired, that they might do or overlook almost anything. Whether Nichol Kessinger was a victim of that manipulation, something more than a victim, or something more than either, remains the question at the core of this case. And it is the question that 8 years of public record have never fully resolved. Here is where the documented evidence stands as of 2026. A phone that pinged a cell tower near the Watts family home at 6:16 in the morning on the day of the murders, a location it had never once appeared in months of prior records. A home address searched on Google less than 36 hours before those murders. 156 minutes of phone calls on the night of the murders that she could not coherently account for during recorded interviews with law enforcement. A phone wiped before it was surrendered to investigators. A call placed within seconds of a police interview beginning at 2 in the morning. An alibi witness she acknowledged existed, and then declined to name. Any single one of those items, standing alone, can be rationalized. Each one in isolation has a potential explanation that does not require drawing the most serious conclusion. But all of them together, in sequence, aligned precisely with the timeline of a murder that claimed 4 lives, do not submit to individual rationalization. The pattern they form is not the product of coincidence stacked 6 times in a row, in exact chronological alignment with a triple homicide. Shanann Watts was 34 years old. She worked from home, building a business, and a life she documented openly and generously. She loved her daughters with everything she had. She was 15 weeks pregnant, with a boy she had already named Nico Lee. She had a prenatal appointment on the morning of August 13th. She never arrived. Bella was 4. It was supposed to be the beginning of the chapter every child deserves. The first day of school. Celeste was 3. She had every right to a future. Nico never had a single moment outside the womb. None of them chose any part of what happened. None of them had any say. The only thing any of us can do, 8 years on, is refuse to allow the complete story to be buried alongside them. The phone records exist. The interview transcripts exist. The coordinates and the timestamps exist. The questions they raise are documented and real. Whether anyone in a position of legal authority chooses to revisit them is not a question that can be answered here tonight. But the evidence does not become less true because it remains unacted upon, and it does not become less worth knowing. That is what Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico deserve. Not silence, not a closed file, not the version of this story that ends the moment one man entered a plea. The full truth, wherever it leads. This work exists for one reason, because the people who did not get to speak for themselves deserve voices that refuse to go quiet. If you believe that, subscribe to True Crime Dre right now. And if this brought you something new, something the standard coverage of this case never gave you, click like. It matters more than you know. It tells us to keep going, and we will keep going. For Shanann, for Bella, for Celeste, for Nico. Justice is not a moment. It is a direction, And we are not done moving toward it. Chris Watts sat in courtrooms. He sat in prison interview rooms. He wrote letters. He gave multiple confessions across multiple years. And in all of it, across every word he has ever spoken about that night, he has never truly answered that question. Not because the answer does not exist, but because the answer was never hidden inside a single confession or a single statement. It was scattered across years of evidence that most people never think to look at. It was in every video Shanann ever posted, in every smile Chris ever forced for the camera, in every unpaid bill and silent dinner and sleepless night the world never saw. The reasons were always there, documented and time-stamped, long before August 13th arrived. What you are about to hear are not theories. They are not speculation. They are facts drawn from the discovery record, from verified financial documents, from the observations of forensic psychologists and criminal profilers who have studied this case and others like it. And by the time we are finished, you will understand not just what Chris Watts did, but the specific, traceable, profoundly disturbing path that brought him there. This is not a story about a monster. It is something far worse. It is a story about a particular kind of ordinary man and the catastrophic damage that kind of man is capable of when every door he refused to open finally closes at once. If you are watching this channel for the first time, this is true crime. We go deeper than the headlines and further than the surface. If the kind of analysis you are about to hear is what you've been looking for, subscribe now and hit like. It tells us to keep going, and we intend to keep going. To understand why Chris Watts did what he did, you first have to understand what his life actually looked like. Not the version the world was shown, but the one he woke up inside of every single day. From the outside, it was the American dream, rendered in suburban perfection. A 5-bedroom home on a quiet street in Frederick, Colorado. 2 little girls with matching outfits and bright, gap-toothed smiles. A 3rd child on the way. A husband and wife who appeared inseparable, always smiling, always posting, always performing for the audience Shanann had built with genuine passion and relentless effort. Shanann Watts was magnetic. She was funny and driven and deeply lovable. Her Facebook live videos pulled thousands of viewers. She talked about her family, her health supplements, her life with an energy that felt real, because for her, it was real. She documented everything. Family dinners, doctor visits, the girls counting in Spanish, Bella telling the camera she wanted a mermaid birthday party, Celeste refusing to say goodbye to the audience, and Chris standing in the background, quiet, smiling, nodding when required. From the outside, he looked like a devoted husband, a proud father, a man who had everything a person could want. But the camera never showed what was underneath. The house was beautiful, but the mortgage was behind. The cars were clean, but they were leased. The luxury trips Shanann posted about, the resort getaways, and spa days and cocktail parties were funded by her company's rewards program, while the actual household bills were piling up in a drawer. By 2015, just 2 years after purchasing their home, Chris and Shanann had filed for bankruptcy. They listed nearly $70,000 in unsecured debt, and by the summer of 2018, 3 years later, they were sliding toward the same edge again. Final notices were arriving. Credit cards were maxed. Medical bills sat unpaid. And Shanann, now 15 weeks pregnant with their 3rd child, was still filming videos, still posting updates, still telling her followers that Thrive was changing lives. For Shanann, those videos were survival. They were her business, her identity, her way of staying afloat and proving to herself and the world that things were going to be okay. She was building something. She believed in it. But for Chris, every video was a lie he could not afford. Every post was a performance he could no longer sustain. Every comment from a stranger that said, "You two are couple goals," felt like pressure, applied to a fracture no one could see. He did not tell Shanann how bad it felt. He did not tell his parents. He did not tell a single person on earth. He just smiled when the camera pointed at him and quietly disappeared inside himself, one day at a time, for years. This is where the story of August 13th actually begins. Not with an affair, not with a Monday morning. It begins here, in the slow and silent suffocation of a man who was living a life he could no longer recognize as his own, and who lacked the basic emotional capacity to say so. In the months before the murders, Shanann confided to close friends that something felt profoundly wrong. She described Chris as distant, cold, emotionally unreachable. She used the word immune. She said he had become a different person, someone she no longer recognized. She was right about all of it, but she did not know why, and Chris never told her. Because Chris Watts had a specific psychological profile that investigators and researchers identified clearly in the aftermath of the case. He was deeply people-pleasing. He was chronically conflict avoidant, and he was fundamentally incapable of expressing emotional distress in a direct or healthy way. Friends and family described the same pattern going back years. Shanann decided, and Chris agreed. She was outspoken, ambitious, driven by a clarity about what she wanted. He was deferential, quiet, agreeable to a degree that went far beyond kindness into something closer to self-erasure. Shanann was not a controlling woman in any malicious sense. She was a person who knew what she wanted and pursued it with everything she had. But in a marriage where one partner is constantly expanding and the other is constantly shrinking, the physics eventually become unsustainable. Something has to give, and Chris had been shrinking for years. He stopped speaking up about money. He stopped pushing back about the constant filming. He stopped advocating for the things he needed from the relationship. He stopped, eventually, feeling like a participant in his own life, and started feeling like a bystander watching someone else live it for him. Forensic psychologists who study family annihilators, men who murder their entire families, have identified one trait that appears in virtually every case. It is not rage. It is not hatred toward the victims. It is not even cruelty. It is a profound and accumulated loss of personal identity. A man who no longer knows who he is outside the role he has been assigned, and who, rather than doing the painful and necessary work of finding himself, of speaking up, of asking for change, of walking away, chooses instead to erase the circumstances he has come to associate with feeling lost. Chris Watts was not a cinematic villain. He was something far more ordinary and far more dangerous. A deeply avoidant man who had spent years burying every need, every frustration, every quiet desperation, until there was simply no more room underground. And that pattern, the choice to bury instead of speak, had been doing its work long before August 2018 ever arrived. The financial picture matters enormously in understanding the psychology of what happened, because the financial picture was not merely a stressor. It was the architecture of the cage Chris felt trapped inside. By the summer of 2018, the family home had a mortgage they were actively falling behind on. Foreclosure was not a distant hypothetical. It was an approaching reality. The 2015 bankruptcy had listed debts spanning credit cards, medical bills, and personal loans. Shanann's income from Louvel Thrive was inconsistent, built on recruitment and sales, and the kind of relentless social media presence she was maintaining at personal cost. Chris's salary from Anadarko Petroleum was steady, but it was not enough to cover what they owed and what they spent. They were, by every objective financial measure, in serious trouble. But the psychology beneath the numbers is where this becomes critical. Chris Watts was not simply afraid of debt. He was afraid of exposure. There is a particular kind of shame that overtakes men who have been conditioned since childhood to believe their value is defined by their ability to provide. Chris grew up in a working-class family in North Carolina. He was quiet, agreeable, deeply averse to confrontation. He had never been someone who asked for help or admitted weakness. To him, the financial collapse was not merely a practical problem to be solved. It was proof of failure. And failure, public, visible, undeniable failure, was the thing that terrified him more than anything. Now consider what divorce would have meant for a man wired that way. Child support for 2 children, soon to be 3. Legal fees he could not pay. The loss of a house already underwater. His name permanently attached to a failed marriage, failed finances, a failed version of the life he had been performing for years. In his distorted psychology, divorce was not a way out. It was a magnification of everything he was most ashamed of. He would not merely be losing a marriage. He would be losing the final threads of the image he had spent years holding together with both hands. And so he never asked for a divorce. He never consulted a lawyer. He never sat Shanann down and said, "This is not working. I am drowning. We need to have an honest conversation." He said nothing, and he said nothing again, and he said nothing again, until the accumulated silence became something far more dangerous than any argument could ever have been. This is what investigators, forensic psychologists, and criminologists mean when they say Chris Watts did not snap. He eroded, slowly, silently, across months and years. The man who committed those murders had been assembled piece by piece out of 1,000 moments of avoidance, shame, and silence. The financial pressure did not transform him into a killer, but it built the walls of the cage he believed he could never escape. And caged men who are passive, avoidant, and saturated with shame do not fight their way out through the front door. They find another exit, and they take everyone with them. Before we reach what that exit looked like, there is something that needs to be addressed, because it is the part of this story that most accounts get fundamentally wrong. Everyone talks about the affair. Everyone talks about Nichol Kessinger. Everyone points to her as the reason, the motive, the explanation for why a father murdered his children and his pregnant wife. But that framing misses something essential. Nichol Kessinger was not the cause. She was the accelerant. The fire had been burning for years before she ever entered the picture. And what she actually represented to Chris Watts, psychologically, is the element that changes how the entire case must be understood. In the spring of 2018, Chris began an affair with Nico Kessinger, a co-worker at Anadarko Petroleum, and nearly every media account you have ever encountered frames this the same way. An affair, a motive, a reason. But what Nichol represented to Chris was not simply another woman. She was a second identity. Think about who Chris was inside his marriage. He was the background, the prop, the man who nodded on cue, the provider who was failing at providing, the husband of a woman with thousands of followers whose entire life was broadcast to the world. Now, think about who he was with Nichol. She did not know about the debt. She did not know about the bankruptcy. She had no idea the house was underwater, or the credit cards were maxed, or that a third child was on the way. Investigators later confirmed that Nichol Kessinger believed Chris was in the final stages of a separation. She believed she was dating a man who was essentially single. She was deceived. To her, Chris was a quiet, attentive, available man, and in her presence, he did not feel like a failure. He felt new. He felt visible, not as a husband, not as a father, not as a prop in someone else's business, as a man, as a person someone wanted. Forensic psychologists identify this as one of the most dangerous psychological states a family annihilator can enter. They call it the fantasy replacement. It is the moment when the imagined life, the new life, the clean life, the life without consequences becomes more vivid and more emotionally real to a person than the actual life they are living. Chris was not merely having an affair. He was rehearsing a replacement existence. He was mentally inhabiting a world where the debt did not exist, where the crying did not exist, where the cameras did not exist, where the pressure did not exist. And the more time he spent inside that world, the more the real world, the one with the mortgage and the daughters and the pregnancy and the approaching collapse, felt like something to be fled from, rather than lived in. By July and August of 2018, Nichol was asking real questions. Had he filed for divorce yet? Why was Shanann still calling? When was any of this going to move forward? And Chris had no answers, because in the real world, the one that actually existed, nothing had moved forward at all. He was still smiling for the camera, still mowing the lawn, still showing up to work and running out of time on every front. The affair did not create a killer, but the fantasy did. The moment Chris Watts began to believe that the life he had imagined with Nichol was more important than the lives that already existed in front of him. That was the moment this case stopped being a story about infidelity and became something incomparably darker. There is a video that Shanann posted in the months before her death. It is one of many, but this one has stayed with the people who have studied this case longer than almost any other piece of footage in the record. It shows Bella, 4 years old, standing in front of the camera. Her hair is in a ponytail. She is wearing a bright shirt. She holds her small hands in front of her and recites a poem with complete sincerity and total trust in the words she is saying. My daddy is a hero. He helps me grow up strong. He reads me books. He ties my shoes. That little girl loved her father completely, without condition, without hesitation, without awareness of anything other than the man who kissed her goodnight and held her hand and was, in her small and certain world, everything a father should be. Chris Watts killed her. He killed her in her own home in the early hours of a Monday morning while she slept, and then he carried her body to an oil field 62 miles away and placed it inside a crude oil storage tank. She was 4 years old. How does a man arrive at that moment? How does a father who once genuinely loved his children, who once lit up at their smiles, who once had bedtime routines and favorite cartoons and inside jokes with a 4-year-old, become capable of what he did? The answer is gradual, and it is deeply disturbing. Chris Watts, by every available account, was once a present and engaged father. The early family videos confirm it. He held Celeste in his arms during Facebook Lives. He played with both girls in the backyard. He was there, genuinely there in the beginning. But as his marriage deteriorated, as the financial pressure mounted, as his sense of identity eroded, he began to withdraw from his children in the same quiet, non-confrontational way he withdrew from everything else in his life. He stopped coming home early. He stopped engaging during the evenings. He stopped asking about their days. He was still physically present. He still kissed them goodnight. He still appeared in the photographs. But the emotional connection had been thinning for months. And in the psychology of family annihilation, this gradual disconnection is not incidental to the crime. It is essential to it. Forensic psychologists who have studied these cases consistently identify a process they call dehumanization by association. It does not mean the man suddenly hates his children. It means his children have become, in his distorted perception, inseparable from the life he is trying to escape. They are not separate from the pressure. They are part of it. The noise, the cost, the obligation, the permanent proof that he cannot simply walk away and begin again. In Chris's fractured thinking, Bella and Celeste were not just his daughters anymore. They were the reason he could never be free. They were the reason Nichol would eventually ask questions he could not answer. They were the reason divorce would destroy him financially. They had become, in his selfish and cowardly calculation, obstacles standing between him and the clean life he had already begun to inhabit inside his own mind. And that is perhaps the most chilling truth this case has to offer. Not that Chris Watts was born a monster, but that love, genuine love, real love, the kind that makes a man hold his daughter's hand and read her bedtime stories, can be eroded. It can be worn down by pressure, by avoidance, by fantasy, by the slow and deliberate choice to stop showing up emotionally while continuing to show up physically. He did not become a man who could kill his children overnight. He became that man across months and years of choosing his own comfort over their reality, of choosing silence over honesty, of choosing the fantasy over the family that was right in front of him. Bella walked into the room that morning. She was 4 years old. She saw her mother on the floor and asked what was wrong, and Chris Watts made a choice. There is a specific type of killer that criminologists and FBI behavioral analysts describe as uniquely terrifying. Not the explosive killer, not the rage-driven killer, not the one who snaps in a moment of overwhelming emotion and then collapses under the weight of what they have done. The terrifying ones are the quiet ones, the ones who smile for the camera, the ones who mow the lawn the morning after, the ones who stand in front of a news crew on the porch of the house where it happened and say, with steady eyes and a practiced tremble in their voice, "My kids are my life. Those smiles light up my life." Chris Watts gave that interview on the afternoon of August 14th, 2018. He stood on his own front lawn, looked into a camera, and described missing his daughters. He talked about their cartoon couches, Minnie Mouse and Sophia, how they would cuddle up and watch television. He said the house felt empty without them. He said it was tearing him apart. Every word was a performance delivered with the same passive, agreeable, people-pleasing demeanor he had practiced his entire life. The only difference was what he was concealing. Chris Watts was conflict avoidant, to a degree that most people cannot fully comprehend. For years, he had suppressed every problem, every need, every uncomfortable emotion that might have caused even minor friction. He said yes when he meant no. He smiled when he meant to cry. He stayed silent when he needed to speak. He performed the role of happy husband, proud father, capable provider, even as every single one of those roles was collapsing beneath him. Criminal profilers who have commented publicly on cases of this nature have noted that what makes family annihilators so difficult to identify in advance is precisely this quality of passivity. They do not present as dangerous. They have no violent histories. They do not threaten, or argue, or break things, or raise their voices. They simply disappear into themselves, inch by inch, day by day. And then, at the moment when every wall closes in simultaneously, when every lie is about to be exposed, when every fantasy is about to be demolished by reality, they do not confront the crisis. They erase it. By the early hours of August 13th, the collision was unavoidable. Shanann had returned from a business trip to Arizona at approximately 2 a.m. She was 15 weeks pregnant. She was exhausted, and she had spent weeks confiding in friends that something felt deeply, fundamentally wrong, that Chris felt checked out in a way she had never experienced before. She had no idea how far gone he actually was, because while Shanann was in Arizona, Chris had been with Nichol. And when Shanann walked through her own front door that night, the two worlds Chris had been keeping carefully separated were about to collide inside the same house, inside the same silence. And Chris Watts, the man who had spent his entire adult life avoiding confrontation at any cost, made his choice not to confess, not to ask for help, not to do the honest, painful, human thing that would have caused suffering but preserved 4 lives. He chose to eliminate the tension by eliminating the people connected to it. And the most chilling dimension of that choice is how he carried it out, quietly. In the early hours of a Monday morning, while his daughters slept, without an explosion, without a breakdown, without a single raised voice, with the same calm, passive detachment that had defined every day of his adult existence, now directed toward the most monstrous act a human being can commit. Afterward, he went to work. He ate lunch. He sent text messages. He answered phone calls from co-workers. And that afternoon, he stood in front of a television camera and asked the world to help bring his family home. This is the truth about Chris Watts that most accounts are afraid to state plainly. He was not a different person on the morning of August 13th. He was exactly the same person he had always been, a man who avoided, a man who suppressed, a man who performed. He simply performed in a different direction. There is a line that appeared in early analysis of this case that has stayed with researchers and criminal psychologists in the years since. Chris Watts did not kill his family because he lost control. He killed them because he wanted control back. Consider the dynamic of that marriage one more time. Shanann was organized, public, outspoken, deeply ambitious. She ran the household. She managed the visible structure of their finances. She directed the content. She made decisions about the children's schedules, their outfits, their social media appearances. She built the brand. She drove the narrative, and Chris followed. For years, Chris Watts had been a passenger in his own life, not because Shanann forced that on him, but because his passive nature made the path of least resistance the only path he could ever bring himself to take. He never pushed back. He never demanded a different role. He never said, "This is not working for me." He never advocated for himself in the way that a psychologically functional human being must in order to remain whole. He simply went along, and going along, year after year, in a life that increasingly felt like it belonged to someone else, produced a man who felt completely powerless, invisible, overlooked, and suffocated. Forensic psychiatrists who study cases of family annihilation identify the core of this psychology with precision. It is not hatred. It is not even anger, though anger may be present. It is the catastrophic convergence of powerlessness and entitlement. A man who feels he has no control over his own life, and who has, somewhere along the way, developed the unspoken belief that he is owed a different one. Chris Watts felt trapped, genuinely, completely trapped. The debt, the marriage, the pregnancy, the affair that was about to collapse, the image that was about to shatter. And for the first time in his adult life, perhaps the only time, he made a unilateral decision. He did not ask permission. He did not wait to be directed. He did not defer to anyone. He acted, and in the most horrific and cowardly way imaginable, he seized back the control he had spent years surrendering, one silent concession at a time. The judge who sentenced him on November 19, 2018, after 17 years on the bench and thousands of cases, called it the most inhumane and vicious crime he had ever handled. And Chris Watts sat in that courtroom the same way he had sat everywhere else, quiet, passive, detached, the same man he had always been. After his conviction and sentencing, Chris Watts did not disappear into silence. He continued to speak, in interviews, in letters, in prison conversations, producing a trail of partial admissions and shifting narratives that, taken together, reveal more than any single confession he has ever given. In December 2018, investigators conducted a 5-hour follow-up interview at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. In that conversation, later released to the public, Chris provided new details about the sequence of events on the night of August 12th and the early morning of August 13th. He described what happened. He described his state of mind, but he still could not produce a reason that held together under its own weight. In 2019, he participated in what became known as the Sermon on the Mount interview, a conversation with two men from a religious ministry he had connected with inside the prison system. In that exchange, he described being in a dark place, claimed he had been spiritually deceived, and insisted he was no longer the same person who committed those acts. Investigators and psychologists who reviewed the recording observed a familiar pattern. The language was rehearsed. The emotional affect was flat. He described the destruction of his own family with the same practiced calm he had demonstrated while standing in front of cameras 2 days after carrying it out. It was a performance of remorse, not the thing itself. And then in 2021, letters he had written to a pen pal, a woman he had never met in person, surfaced in media reporting. In those letters, Chris revealed things he had never disclosed in any official interview or courtroom proceeding. He wrote that he had been planning the murders for several weeks. He wrote that on the morning of August 13th, he had first attempted to smother his daughters in their beds while they slept, and was initially unsuccessful. He wrote that Bella woke up, that she saw him with Shanann, that Celeste asked him what was wrong with Mommy. He wrote these things not to investigators, not into the court record, not under oath. He wrote them to a stranger, in a letter, from a prison cell. Because confession, for a man like Chris Watts, is never about accountability. It is about audience. It is about finding someone who will listen and absorb the horror without requiring him to face it directly. It is about distributing the weight of what he has done without ever truly picking it up himself. This is what the years since the conviction have revealed. The truth of why Chris Watts killed his family has never arrived in a single statement, because it was never contained in one. It has assembled itself across 6 years of interviews, letters, confessions, and contradictions. From the gaps between his words, from the things he almost said, and then retreated from the facts investigators confirmed independently, from the details his own correspondence revealed when he thought no one outside the envelope would ever read them. The truth was always there. Chris Watts simply never had the courage or the self-awareness to say it all in one place. And here is what the silence itself tells us, more clearly than any confession ever could. The silence is the answer. Chris Watts has never given a full, coherent, integrated explanation for what he did, because a full explanation would require a level of emotional honesty and self-knowledge he has never possessed, and almost certainly never will. It would require him to say the following words: I was ashamed of my failures, and too weak to face them. I built a fantasy, and chose it over the lives of my own children. I felt invisible and powerless, and instead of finding my voice, I destroyed the people who witnessed my inadequacy. I was not a good husband in the ways that mattered most. I was not a good father in the end. And rather than become one, I chose to erase the proof that I had failed. He has never said those words. He may never say them, but they are true. They are written in every video Shanann posted where Chris stands quietly in the background, present and absent at the same time. They are written in every unpaid bill and maxed credit card. They are written in every text he sent Nichol while his pregnant wife was on a business trip, trying to save a marriage she did not know was already gone. They are written in the courtroom where the names of his daughters were read into the record, and he sat perfectly still. The silence he left behind has always spoken louder than he ever could. The prosecution told the court what the evidence proved with language that requires no embellishment. It takes 2 to 4 minutes to strangle someone to death manually. The horror that Shanann must have felt as the man she loved wrapped his hands around her throat and choked the life out of her must have been unimaginable. The prosecution then spoke about Bella and Celeste, what they must have experienced, what they must have thought. The one man on this planet who was supposed to nurture and protect them was snuffing out their lives. They both died from smothering. The prosecutor paused and then repeated the word. The man seated to my right smothered his daughters. Bella fought back for her life. In one final measure of disrespect for the family he once had, he ensured that they would not be together even in death. He disposed of them in different locations. All of this for what? The prosecution answered its own question. His motive was simple. He had a desire for a fresh start, to begin a relationship with a new love that overpowered all decency and feelings for his wife, his daughters, and his unborn son. While Shanann texted him over and over in the days and weeks leading up to her death, attempting to save their marriage, Chris was saving photographs of his girlfriend and texting her through the night. While Shanann sent him self-help and relationship counseling books, one of which was found thrown in the garbage, he was searching the internet for secluded vacation spots and researching jewelry for another woman. While Shanann took the girls to visit family in North Carolina, Chris went to car museums and the sand dunes with Nico Kessinger. The judge delivered the sentence. 5 consecutive life terms, no possibility of parole, and language that has echoed through every discussion of this case since. This is perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime I have handled out of the thousands of cases I have seen. Nothing less than the maximum sentence would be appropriate. Anything less would depreciate the seriousness of this offense. Shanann Watts was 34 years old. She was 15 weeks pregnant. She had built something from nothing, a business, a platform, a life she was genuinely proud of. She had fought through lupus. She had survived hard years. She had loved her daughters with everything she had and documented that love openly and generously because she believed in the life she was building. She did not deserve what happened to her. Bella Watts was 4 years old. She wanted a mermaid birthday party with a mermaid crown. She counted in Spanish for the camera. She told the world her daddy was a hero. She fought back. She did not deserve what happened to her. Celeste Watts was 3 years old. She ate marshmallows and said everything was hot and made her mother laugh in the middle of Facebook Lives. She was spirited and joyful and entirely innocent. She did not deserve what happened to her. Nico Watts was never born. He was 15 weeks in gestation. He had a name. He had a nursery being prepared. He had a mother who wanted him. He did not deserve what happened to him. Chris Watts is currently serving 5 consecutive life sentences at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. He will die inside those walls. He will never see another sunrise that is not filtered through a prison window. He will spend the remainder of his natural life in a space smaller than the cage he once imagined himself trapped inside, and the life he destroyed his family to reach, the fresh start, the clean slate, the fantasy, the version of himself he was so desperate to become He never lived it. Not for a single day. Because here is what men like Chris Watts never understand, until it is irreversibly too late. The cage was never the house. The cage was never the marriage. The cage was never the children, or the debt, or the cameras, or the constant pressure of performing a life he did not feel belonged to him. The cage was him, his avoidance, his silence, his inability to face himself honestly, his lifelong refusal to say what he needed, to ask for what he lacked, to admit what he feared. You cannot escape a cage built from your own psychology by destroying the people around you. You carry that cage with you into every room you ever enter for the rest of your life. Chris Watts did not kill his family because he was a monster who materialized from nowhere on a Monday morning. He killed them because he was a specific kind of ordinary, a passive, avoidant, shame-saturated, fantasy-chasing man who chose cowardice at every single turning point until cowardice consumed everything around him. He killed because he was drowning financially and too proud to ask for help. He killed because he felt invisible in his own life and too passive to change it. He killed because a fantasy felt more real to him than his own daughters' faces. He killed because fatherhood had become weight instead of purpose. And he chose, inch by inch, day by day, to let it become that. He killed because he had spent years building a cage out of silence. And when the cage finally closed, silence was the only response he knew. He did not kill out of hatred. He killed to escape. And the most devastating truth of this entire case, the one that will follow you after this is over, is that it did not have to happen at any point, at any moment, at any one of the 1,000 silent nights that led to that Monday morning. He could have spoken. He could have asked for help. He could have chosen honesty over image. He could have chosen courage over comfort. He could have chosen his daughters' lives over his own fantasy. He chose wrong every single time. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico Watts deserved better. They deserved a husband and father who, when the walls closed in, chose truth instead of silence. They deserve to be here. They are not here because one man made a series of choices that no amount of prison time and no number of confessions will ever make right. What we can do is remember them as they were, not as victims of a crime, but as people who lived and laughed and loved and who were taken from a world that was better for having them in it. If this helped you understand something about this case you had not understood before, share it with someone. Because somewhere, someone still believes this was just about an affair. It was not. It was never that simple. And the more people who understand the full picture, the harder it becomes for cases like this one to be reduced to a headline and forgotten. If you want to go deeper, if you want the psychology behind the crimes, the warning signs that get missed, the questions that never get answered, subscribe to True Crime. This channel exists because the people who did not get to speak for themselves deserve more than silence. And we are here to make sure they get it. For Shanann, for Bella, for Celeste, for Nico. They deserve the world, and the world should never stop saying their names.